to warn everyone, this is our 13th virtual workshop today at 9 o'clock in the morning here, and opposite ends from all over the world. Everybody's here from all over the world. So we have people from Canada and we have people from Australia, Germany, just lots and lots of different places. So thank you very much to all of you for attending, and thank you to our presenters for being here. Oh, I noticed we have people from Japan as well. So thank you all for being here. So our first presentation is from Nadia Matridge from the London School of Economics, and her presentation is The Meandering Trajectories of Financial Innovations, commercial paper and its uses in 16th century Lyon's trading networks.
Okay, so first of all, thanks very much, Karen, for the invitation. And I guess this paper uses accounting to discuss the circulation of commercial paper. So I'm going to discuss book transfers and things like that, and how they did things similar to endorsement, for example, with book transfers. But the topic was really about the evolution of financial techniques. So financial innovation, I guess you could do a whole paper on whether innovation exists and what's the difference between innovation and change. So I was actually asked to frame the paper like that. And so the idea, I mean, in economic history, in financial history, when we talk about financial innovation, very often it's, for example, new financial instruments, for example, when the bill of exchange started to be used, technologies, institutions, I don't know, for example, commercial tribunals, or it could even be a business model like startups today. So very often it's described as something important that drives economic growth. In the framework of financial systems, it would be something that makes the integration of markets easier, the circulation of information, or that diminishes transaction costs. But then if you look at the literature in finance, you can see that they also insist that it's not a linear process. It's a bit more complex, like you have sometimes interactions between people that change things. So for example, the thing that first emerged was that then a bit translated, and then it changed along the way. And then the translation itself perhaps makes the truth of the innovation come out. So there are lots of discussions on these things. And of course, this involves contextual influences. So, where did this innovation occur, like geographical, like structural mechanisms of markets, and then the influence of various stakeholders. So not only merchants, but maybe engineers, thinkers, governments. And so the main idea is that, yes, it necessarily encompasses phenomenon of adaptation. So what I try to do here, I see your faces a bit on my screen. And do you know if there is a way where I see my screen better?
I think if you click on us, you can move us up, so we're not across your slides.
If you go on the top right, you should have the word view.
Because I also have like participant has enabled closed captioning in the middle of my screen. Maybe, yeah, okay. Now that's better. Sorry. Okay, so when we think about innovation in Europe's economic development, there's a very strong model of economic development that you will find underpinning a lot of papers in this field. And basically, it's based on the idea that you have a division between regions that are more backward, where you don't have actors that really master sophisticated financial instruments. You don't have institutions for commerce and finance. You don't you don't have all these things that make innovation possible. And then you have the network of the big financial centers. So you have this geographical division, and then at the same time, you have a chronological succession between the right line of financial centers. So, you know, Venice, and then Lyon, and then Antwerp, and then Amsterdam, and then London. And so then together, of course, you have the rise to prominence of different merchant groups. So if you think about Italians, for example, you know, in the literature, it seems like they are dominating until maybe the mid-16th century, and they are the inventors of bills of exchange, double entry bookkeeping, etc. And then they are being taken over by the Flemish, who develop more like the transferability and negotiability of bills of exchange and commercial paper in general. And then even within the Italians, you have this kind of competition between Genoese and Florentine, and then the Genoese take over with their own fairs after the Lyon fairs. And so the idea is not to say that this model doesn't work at all or is wrong, or but the idea is that sometimes you, when you look at like that, you miss certain things, and then maybe you end up perhaps being wrong about where an innovation came from, or who was really using certain technique. And I think it's important to know these things, because sometimes, you know, it can help refining this kind of greater narrative. And so what happened in practice was that merchants were in constant collaborations. If you look at their account books, if you look at the transactions, you will see Italians interacting with Flemish merchants, Florentine interacting with Genoese. So you see that all the time. So they were in contact, they were exchanging, and they were involved in the exact same operations together. And so if you look at that, then you start doubting a bit more, like, oh, who was actually, you know, more qualified to do certain transactions? Was there really so much segmentation between the technical skills of different actors? And if there wasn't, why is that some of them used certain techniques like endorsement and discounts and others didn't? So the archives are Salviati archives. It's one of the first banks in Lyon in the 16th century. And they are specialized in the commission business. So this means that when you look at their ledgers, you don't only see what they are doing with their own correspondents or clients, you also see what clients and correspondents are doing between them. So you have a slightly larger view, let's say, that if you have someone who only does proprietary trading. Anyway, no one was doing only that, but they are really specialized in the commission business. And so the findings, the main findings are that, yes, some practices are more common in the northwest of Europe than in the Mediterranean area, and vice versa. But the reasons for this differentiated use of financial techniques is not so clear, and it's definitely not a difference in technical skills or innovation. So you have the French that you see using bills of exchange. You have Italians using techniques that are payments techniques that one would consider more rudimentary, like, I don't know, barter or cash. And then you have innovations. For example, the ricorsa is supposed to be a Genoese innovation, but you find it in 16th century Lyon. I'm sure you would find it earlier as well. And so these are the techniques I'm going to discuss. So ricorsa, assignment, and discount. So let's start with the French. They are not very well known, but when they are described in the literature on medieval, early modern, you had a lot of Italians in France, in Lyon, and the Italians were definitely organizing the Lyon market, this import of silks and then the exports of southern products towards the north. So they were organizing the commerce, the international commerce, but also the foreign exchange. So they were establishing exchange rates, they were dealing in bills of exchange, etc. So yes, that you can't deny that they were dominant on the market, on the Lyon market. But then as a result, there's often people who have written on that had kind of assumed that the French are basically only using very simple payment instruments, like they're only using IOUs, they don't know about exchange, and they don't do international trade and finance. They're only like redistributing the products that the Italians are importing and then paying with very simple means, so cash or IOUs. But so in the archives of the Salviati, you see that they don't have the choice. They have to interact with the French. And so you have, in particular, between Lyon and Paris, you have lots of circulation of money, obviously, because the court was in Paris and Lyon was, where the king very often requested. I mean, it was a loan market. And then you also had this this trade of pricey silkeries, from Lyon to Paris for the courts. So there was lots of traffic, lots of official agents circulating. So it was also a very safe, a very good, quick road postal service. And what I found is that half of the time, when they transfer funds via bills of exchange to Paris, they interact with French merchants who absolutely issue bills or pay them, and it's actually significant sums. It's not small sums. So first, it shows that yes, the French could do bills of exchange, but also they had actually interesting financial capacities that you may not necessarily expect. So this is an example here. And then you see, on the other hand, the Salviati very often transferring cash. So it's not that they were just doing bills of exchange, and they were doing that either because the king had explicitly requested cash, or when exchange rates were unfavorable, they didn't hesitate. They even sent cash to Antwerp when the exchange rates were bad, unprofitable. And then on the other hand, you can see that, okay, it's not so surprising that they transfer cash domestically, but actually sometimes even for international payment, they're going to use IOUs and not bills of exchange. So for example, there's in the Salviati Bank, there's a provider of silks, and to pay, this merchant purchases raw silk in the Lyon fairs, which comes from Spain, and then exports, sells the silkeries. And so to pay for the purchase of raw silk from Spain, they are actually selling their IOUs from French clients that are buying the silks to the Salviati. And then you also see the Salviati sometimes doing barter, like monetized barter, because it's in the account book. So, you have a price on each side with Flemish merchants, Scandinavian merchants, sometimes German merchants. So the next example is the ricorsa. So this is a way where you use bills of exchange for long-term credits. And in literature, it's described as a Genoese innovation that developed in the Genoese fairs of Besançon, and was basically attached to this great financial system around, Charles V and then Philip II, where it was used to finance the loans together with the Asiento, obviously. And so what happens is that you have a bill circulating, you have round trips of bills between two markets. And then, of course, due to differences in exchange rates and the existence of a rate spread, you can increase your profit like that over several years. So the idea basically for the ricorsa is that the contract has to be, done in advance. And then it lasts for a very long time, and it's the same sum. So I found several examples within the Salviati ledgers. So some were with Rome, some were with Venice, and most were with Florence. And you have one example here of a Prato shopkeeper. And you can see that he's putting approximately 100 scudi on the exchange for a total from December 1543 to February 1548. So here you can see that despite the spread not being much worse, there's not a direct correlation, let's say, between the spread and the fact that the operation continues, because it's just automatic. So at some point he passes, but then as often happens within these ledgers, and why? Because the plan was that if he passes, then the money goes to the wife, but then the wife doesn't occur, and then he still has an account, but that doesn't really matter. This was just to give an example. And here there is a moment where the transaction stops, and then there's more money that is put again, but it doesn't mean that it's a different transaction. So in the account, it remains, if you look at it, it remains the same, but some money is added after a few years. And so the point is that, yes, they were doing that. They were doing round trips of bills since the early Middle Ages anyway. But in Lyon, you can see single transactions that last for several years. And very often these transactions, so they're related to the Genoese. And the argument is that it's very speculative and it's highly immaterial. So I don't really understand this argument, because it's not really speculation on exchange rates. Like, it's not a triangle or, a circulation between 10 markets and trying to get the best spread each time. It's just coming and going. In their own accounts, they call it deposito. And then the other thing is that if you look at the actors involved in the transactions, because of exchange transactions, you always have two sides, right? You have someone who remits money, so, lends, but then you have the taker. So you have someone who's either borrowing or who wants to make a payment abroad, right? And so look at who is involved. You see that very often the people involved are people who actually want to make a payment somewhere because they have purchased merchandise. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is that if you look at what determines the exchange rate in Besançon, it has actually been proven in a book that is not too recent, but very rigorous, by Mondish, where he shows that the way they determined exchange rates, of course, was partially dependent on balances of commerce. And it's not because the trade itself doesn't take place in Besançon, in the Besançon fairs, that it doesn't influence exchange rates. Even if it's taking place elsewhere between these merchants, then it will still influence the balances at the end. Because like I said, many of these bills, even if one side of the transaction is a loan, the other side is actually a payment. So yeah, this raises the question, of course, how practice comes from. And yeah, I guess you had fairs very early in time, so who knows if it was already there in the Champagne fairs, for example. It's very difficult to tell. But this shows you that it's always very difficult to say, oh, it emerged at that time in that place. And the other thing, of course, is the transferability and negotiability of commercial paper. So this is associated with the Flemish merchants. You have a few old works that shows you that there are actually examples of assigned bills of exchange. So as assignment means, yes, there's a transfer of the paper, of the commercial paper, but you don't have this kind of juridical protection that you have with actual endorsement as it develops in 17th century Antwerp. So that's why it's called assigned, but it's the same in terms of the function. So there are a few examples already in the 14th, 15th century in Italian and Spanish archives. And then you have actual endorsements of deposit certificates in 16th century Naples as well. So in the Salviati archives, what you see is that what they're doing very often is in-bank assignments. So what I was telling you before, book transfers, basically. So it's that the issuer or the beneficiary bill just asks the banker to debit or to credit the value in a third party's account rather than their own. And sometimes you have specific clauses in the bills. So either it's like, can you pay this person? Or in the bill, you already have an open order to payable to whomever has my procuration. So it involves the use of procurations, which was also a very common practice in Northwestern Europe at the time. And you can see that the people who use these procurations are very often merchants, even if they are southern merchants. They are involved in the Atlantic trade, so they have Spanish merchants, or they are acting in the Castilian fairs, or they are in Antwerp. But you never see Italian merchants operating in the Mediterranean space that are using these procuration and these open orders. Then you have the bank clause, which is a famous thing because that's where we think that endorsements came from, typically in Northwestern Europe, that it started with the bearer clause to circulate like that, and then you added the juridical dimension of endorsements to that system. And so here you find it as well in the Salviati archives. And it's unlike the procurations, it's always French and Italian merchants active in the south, actually. So you don't see that specifically being used in relation with Antwerp or with Flemish merchants. Then you have the practice of underwriting. And this is a typical Flemish insurance practice where you write, you guarantor for a bill of exchange. And sometimes in the Salvetti archives, you can see that they are using the underwriting as an assignment. So the underwriter is basically asking the creditor to draw a bill on his correspondence for reimbursement of something that he borrowed, like the underwriter. And so I even found one case of underwriting endorsement in the Salvetti archives where the drawer sells the bill to the underwriter, who are the Salvetti, and the signature is actually on the back that time, al dorso. So I know that because it's written in the entries. So you can see that bills were not very strictly formatted before the adoption of endorsement and discount. So it's not that it was very rigid and then suddenly flexible. You had different ways to do the same thing. You also have out-bag transfers. So instead of being book transfers, these are actually transfers of bonds outside of the bank. When it's bills obligatory, you always have the presence of a notary. But overall, it's rather rare, meaning that in-bank book transfer type of assignments are much more common. Why I said the procuration, what is interesting is that while the procuration, yes, you can perhaps hint to a Flemish influence, it's not the case for other forms of assignments, including those outside of the bank. So, you know, this shows you that the Italians were not confined to using that only within banks transfer. So I'm going to finish with discounting. Which is, in the modern sense, the cession of commercial paper to a third party before payment term for, you know, a lower value compared to the nominal one. And so here, usually it's associated with 17th century England, and then it would have come to the continent in the 18th century. Now this has been a bit revised. So Van der Vee has found that, you know, it was quite developed in Antwerp in the 16th century. And then you even have research that shows cases of discounting of tallies by Italian banker as early as the 14th century. So in the Salvetti archives, you have many examples of in-book discounting of royal obligations. Same principle as I was saying about assignment is that they do the same thing, but within their books, which means within that their network of correspondence, which is about 700 people. And then you have the anticipated payment of bills of exchange. So either you don't really have an interest, you have a kind of profit that is made on the fact that, yes, they are paying the bill before the time of the fair. And in Lyon, usually payments could only take place during the fair. So they take an interest for that, but it's not really a discount type of interest. And otherwise, what they do when they pay in advance is that they charge the depositor rate, which was a stable rate from fair to fair. And this is different, of course, from exactly calculating, you know, the term and determining the interest based on that, which would be the case with normal discount. So it's a bit different, but you do have a notion of interest loss. And then finally, I found one classic example of modern discounting calculated as such, which involves a French merchant as the assignees. So to finish, what are the questions and hypotheses? One is obviously the determinants of financial innovation, because you can see that the level of technical development would perhaps allow sometimes the widespread use of certain techniques, but still they don't do it. So why is that? And for Lyon, you can make two hypotheses. I came up with two hypotheses. One was that because there were 4 annual fairs and then all the payments occurred at that time, it was very concentrated to time, and you had the fair banks all in accounts with one another. So if you are a merchant coming to the fair and you want to transfer a debt, it's very easy due to these fair banks being in accounts with one another. So you use that transfer. You don't need actually to do a proper endorsement or discounting outside of the banks. So that would have been one factor, you know, that facilitated the circulation of commercial paper without needing this juridical structure behind it. And then the other one that is often mentioned in the literature, not necessarily in relation with that, but in general, is that the Italians were a bit closed, meaning that they preferred trading within their own network. So even if they had clients, etc., for the they preferred to do them within their own network. And Goldthwait say that there's a tendency towards corporatism, while on the other hand, you would have the Northwestern merchants who are more open. They develop a kind of more open access markets, more impersonal, etc. So you also have that argument. And then the questions that remain are, for example, regarding transferability, endorsement, etc. Because Italians knew about it, had developed similar practices before, is it because of the contacts with that in the end the Flemish merchants develop it, or is it really, did it develop separately over there? That's an open question. And then also what would be interesting, in my opinion, to know is how much did the Northern merchants actually rely on in-bank transfers, because it's very unlikely that they weren't doing it the same as what the Italians were doing, because they were using these double entry ledgers like the same, basically. So if you would look into it, I would be surprised if you didn't find it. So yeah, there's probably interesting research to do in that area. Thanks very much. I'm sorry I went over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nadia. Can I hand you over to Alistair to chair the questions and answers?
Thank you very much, Karen. And sorry I was last minute. It was the trains. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yeah, good. Thanks very much, Nadia. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think, it still causes surprise to some of us that there's so much complexity going on at an earlier date than we sort of envisaged. And it seems to be getting pushed back earlier and earlier. And fascinating to think as well why, sometimes why these instruments weren't used more widely. But anyway, I will open up the floor to questions now, please. So could you just raise your hand if you have a question, and I will keep an eye on the screen here. Thank you, Alan. Yes.
What the little hand does on the screen. I'll put that off, actually. Right. Thanks, Nadia. That was really interesting. I do wonder, just talking generally, I've done a lot of reading, obviously, of medieval stuff like this, and I've also done, I think, of a lot of reading of early modern, because you need to in order to deal with referees. And one thing that struck me about literature in the early modern period is it doesn't know what happened in the medieval period. And once or twice you say, well, maybe that happened earlier, and you give a few examples. And it leads to the literature, the early modern literature, being very assertive about when things took place for the first time, and they really didn't. Recurso is not a Genoese invention, for example. It was being used in Florence in the 14th century. And Reinhold Müller has a whole chapter on it in his book he published in 1997. And it's just a technique that, and Raymond de Roover wrote about it at length. And that's why Raymond de Roover thought that bills of exchange were used to speculate, not to fund trade. And he was looking in medieval documents. So that it's definitely not something that came from the 16th century Genoese. And in the early modern period, Richard Goldthwait's written about the annuity system that was used at the Besançon Fair and other fairs of the period, where Florentines of all walks of life invested in annuities, doing exactly what you describe and show in that diagram. The investments just keep churning over, and when they die, the money goes off to the family. Or when they decide to give up and retire, they just take the money out. And it's a well written up system already. In terms of the two other things, getting in-bank transfers in Milan in 1204, there was a statute passed saying that a creditor could tell his debtor to pay anyone he wants. In 1211, in the Bologna ledger, there are in-bank transfers. and checks were being
Do
used.
you have the references for this? Because if you could put them in the chat, that would be great.
If you just look at Santini's and Lee's translations.
Santini and
Jeffrey Lee's 1970, I can't remember. He's got 2 papers on the Bologna ledger of 1211, and Santini's original transcription in Italian from 1887, but Lee does it in English. And you see the text there, it's actually saying pay this to that.
Mm-hmm.
There were checks in Florence in the early 14th century. And there's actually even a picture of one in a book by Richard Goldthwaite. And on discounting, they were discounting IOUs, which are not necessarily business, they're not commercial paper, they're just IOUs. In 16th century Venice, Manzoni's bookkeeping manual describes how do you record them. And if it got to that point, they must have been around for ages. So you're going back way into the medieval period probably for that. So there's a lot of things going on in medieval period that you could have referred back to, but you don't. But nevertheless, what you talk about, I find it really interesting. So thanks very much for that.
Yeah, and I think I agree with everything you say, and I think we come back to these discussions about, you know, how to cut time. And I remember we tried to organize for a few years an online seminar on financial history, and we were saying, oh, we will make it early modern because there's no financial history seminar on early modern period. And then we started discussing what is that, and we were really lost. So yeah, it's always yeah, and I think that another thing is that sometimes economists as well, because they think a bit in terms of models, you know, they tend to perceive this thing, you know, this kind of segmented evolution. But yeah, I think it would probably be important for all the people doing early modern actually really looking at this literature that you've talked about from the medieval period, because yeah, you would find most things in there. And the medievalists don't tend to talk in these terms. They don't tend to say, oh, this was a complete innovation. They just say, well, this was what's going on, and it's not presented in the same way. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Richard, I can see your hands up. We can't hear you yet, Richard.
Now you can.
Now we can, yes, welcome.
Very interesting, Nadia. Just a thought. The Chinese had something, because Marco Polo comments on the flying money that the Great Khan issued so that remittances could be made all across China. And later on, the famous Shaanxi banks, the Shaanxi Piaohao, they had a network which spread all across China. This is thousands of miles, for enabling remittances to be made. Now, whether there was any discounting or anything, I have no idea. But it's an interesting comparison.
Yeah,
to ask whether the Chinese were, you know, they invented the compass and other things. Had they invented financial instruments of?
Yeah, and do you have references about this flying money in China?
Yeah, it's a very famous book, Marco Polo's Travels. And I'll send you a reference for the Shaanxi Piaohao as well.
Yeah, because this comparison, I think not many people would be able to do them, you know, accurately and in a deep way, but it would be quite fascinating.
Yeah. No, you need a Chinese colleague to do.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't read the stuff; it's impossible. Yeah.
Just on that point, Nadia, the Maghreb traders had the equivalent of bills of exchange in the 11th century. You know, they were.
Who? Sorry, I didn't hear who.
A Maghrebi.
Oh yeah, is this Abner Greif?
Yeah.
Okay.
Gil. and a few other.
Right, thank you very much for those observations, Richard and Alan. And Richard, I'd like to say, no, I didn't mute you. I'd never dream of muting you. Your interventions are always very welcome. Any other?
You would say that, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean it, Richard, as well. Any other comments or observations or questions at all? No, I just had one thought, Nadia. If no one else has a question, and I just was interested in the actual form of the records, because presumably there's the sort of internal record keeping and monitoring of balances, but then you mentioned notaries, and they often were involved with producing quite elaborate documents or certificates to evidence that transactions were outstanding or completed. Have you any observations on the sorts of records you saw? What they looked like?
They're horrible.
They're horrible. Okay.
Yeah. Because you are used to this very nice Italian writing that you read almost like script, and then you go to a notary and it's like abstract art, and you can't read anything. So yeah, I didn't use much notary sources precisely for that reason. But it was, at least for the period that I'm using, and in the context of commerce and finance, the notary is more like a complementary institution, in the sense that for some transactions they are necessary, everything outside of the bank, basically. And then within the bank themselves, you also have evidence of auditors in Italy, at least. So also outside parties who are very often, retired merchants themselves. But I know that the notaries were very involved in credit operations themselves, like in Paris, for example, in the 16th, 17th century, and even more later, even more in the 18th. So you have Philip Hoffman, who has worked on that, on the credit markets constructed by the notaries, basically. But me, it was a bit too. It was not that there was a competition in Lyon between the notaries and the merchants. It was really that the notaries are a kind of almost servant of the merchants, and the Salviati, they called the notary our guy, like our Pierre Dorlin, or yeah. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Nadia. We better draw things to a conclusion. We've got a 5-minute break now, but can we just say a very big thank you to Nadia Matringi from the London School of Economics. Thank you very much indeed for your presentation. Well, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce the next paper, which is being worked on by Mariam Safari, Daniel Richards, and Gary Sprakeman from the York University, University of Toronto, and Melbourne University. And the subject, or the title, is Stories of Whistleblowers, Interaction Among Voice, Silence, and Exit in the Case of Home Bank of Canada, 1905 to 1923. And if I may, Daniel, I will hand over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alistair. I've already had a great introduction, so I wanted to say thank you for having us and giving us the opportunity to present the research to people who can hopefully give us some good feedback. So I'm going to go over the research, but I have to acknowledge Mariam Safari and Gary Sprakeman have worked extensively on this project with me, and today is actually Mariam's birthday, so happy birthday to you, Mariam, just before we get started. What we're going to do today is I'm just going to talk a little bit about whistleblowing, and specifically in the case of a bank in Canada that only existed for a short space of time, but seemed to cause quite a controversy. And what I'm going to talk about is I'm trying to bring out the story of this whistleblowing kind of as it unfolded over the history of the bank. So how did this all start? Well, Mariam actually came to Toronto as a visiting professor, came to York University, and while she was here, she visited a castle. It's called Castleloma, and you can see the picture of it there on screen. And it's a tourist attraction in downtown Toronto. And it's a castle that was built by a person called Sir Henry Pellet. And so he built this castle, as far as castle goes, quite recently. Basically, he funded it, and the way that he funded it was through a bank called the Home Bank of Canada. and by using resources, he could build a castle with the idea that if royalty ever came to visit people in Canada, they could stay at this castle and have a venue suitable to them. Now, our interest in this research project is more in the bank that was used to fund the castle, but this person, Sir Henry Pellet, he'll come back in our case study a little bit later on. So what was the home bank? Well, it was established in 1905, and if you looked at the bank's annual profits from their annual accounts, or if you looked at any kind of newspaper articles about the bank, it was doing very, very well financially. It continued to expand. It was always opening up branches, and everything looked very, very good until 1923, when it had to close the doors and was declared bankrupt. At that stage, there was 60,000 depositors who experienced serious financial loss, and because they experienced such a big financial loss, a royal commission was established to basically investigate, well, how did this happen, and was there any knowledge or information about this kind of bankruptcy happening in advance? And as it turned out, that there actually was, that people inside the bank had actually whistleblown to the Minister of Finance, and they'd done it on 2 occasions. One occasion in 1916, another occasion in 1918. So this bank was a bankruptcy that was not 100% unexpected by people working in the bank, and perhaps to the Minister of Finance at the time. And this is basically the nature of our research. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go over some of the key concepts in the literature before I come back to the story of what happened in the whistleblowing at the bank. So our current study uses a framework thinking about 4 different top ideas or concepts. The first is the idea of voicing concerns. And so there's a lot of literature out there that's looked at why is it or how is it that people use voice in the workplace to make ideas or raise concerns or have suggestions about concepts to management to try and bring about change. They might see something bad happening in the workplace, and so therefore how do they voice those concerns? Generally to management to make it better. The opposite of voice, if you will, is silence, and this is that people will, when they're working, will consciously withhold information. They won't share suggestions. They won't share ideas about what's occurring in the workplace, especially from those people who are able to take action. Another kind of concept which comes up in our case study quite a bit is the idea of exit, and this comes from originally the exit voice loyalty framework provided by Hirschman, and exit is simply when members leave an organization. Now, one kind of concept that I talked about briefly is the idea of whistleblowing, and whistleblowing is like a type of voice. It's basically the idea that you're going to report some wrongdoing about some illegal or unethical behavior in an organization, and that can come at risk of retaliation from other members within that organization. So whistleblowing is like using your voice, where voice would be more internal. Whistleblowing can actually go external to the organization. So you wouldn't just raise concerns to those involved, but also go outside the organization to try and get some kind of change occurring. And these are the 4 concepts we're going to look at in our case study. Now, let's go over the literature just briefly. We'll go over the whistleblowing literature first, and then we'll talk a little bit about the voice literature. The whistleblowing literature is quite vast. There's a lot of literature out there that's tended to look at like what factors are involved with whistleblowing. What is it that will lead a person to, report some wrongdoing about an organization? And the characteristics could depend on the actual whistleblower themselves or the organisation that they're working for. Maybe it's the nature of the wrongdoing that they observe, or maybe it's the culture in which they find themselves about whether or not they should or should not blow the whistle. The literature is quite extensive, and recently the literature that's been conducted has kind of come under critique, and the critique is more based on the methodology, that the methodology to research whistleblowing tends to be survey based, which leads it to be like a one point in time. They'll often send out surveys to ask, would you or would you not blow the whistle? Or perhaps they would send surveys to whistleblowers and non-whistleblowers to try and identify characteristics between the two. The critique that's been raised about this is that this survey kind of can sometimes neglect the subjective experience of being a whistleblower. That if you're going to, report some wrongdoing, it's quite a stressful situation. That whistleblowers themselves are going to feel like they're outside of the company. They're going to feel a lot of self-doubt, like, why am I the person who's speaking up and talking about this type of wrongdoing? Can no one else see it? And also whistleblowers can have a lot of retaliation happening against them, that the organisation will normally, dismiss the person or maybe put them on leave to isolate them, and they can be excluded from a lot of normative practices. And so the research by Kenny basically talked about how whistleblower speech can be derealised. Their ideas that they're raising as impossible speech, they're unable to voice these kind of concerns. The voice literature is very related to the whistleblowing literature. So this is literature that looks about whether people will report some ideas or some concepts to those people within their organisation. The voice literature, like the whistleblowing literature, also tends to use a lot of survey research, and it's turned to look at what are the factors or what are the characteristics which lead a person to voice or to silence. However, this perspective has also been critiqued, or this methodology has been critiqued in the voice literature, as it tends to view voice as occurring as a kind of like a one-time event. A person voices and then kind of stops, and it's dyadic. It's just between the person voicing and the person receiving. So the communication is only kind of one way. So that's what happens with the survey-based type literature, where it tends to identify people are voices or are not voices, or they will be silent. However, more recent research has taken a qualitative approach and found that voices, a lot more complex than what the survey literature would, illustrate. That voice can be kind of a collective process. There's not just the person voicing and the person receiving the information, but there's a lot of other parties involved. And the research by Satterstorm in particular found that if you look at people voicing inside a company, these guys went in and watched a company for 31 months. And they found that often ideas would get voiced and they would get kind of forgotten about, but then later someone would come back and reiterate it, and it would start a process of voicing concerns. In particular, they found that it's what they would call, not a one-time event, but it's a event which occurs over time. That it's essentially not happening just once off, but there's multiple kind of stages to cultivating voice and getting ideas and happening in an organisation. And a review of the literature done by Morrison has called for more research into what they refer to as the temporal dynamics of voice and silence. Like, how can we understand when people voice and when people switch to silence over time? Like, what is the process of switching out of voice and into silence and back out to voice and into silence? And this is the area that we're looking at with our research. Morrison, in her review of all the literature on voice and silence, kind of came up with these types of research questions, saying that this is where research should be pointed at, thinking about factors which predicts from changing from voice to silence or vice versa, and how can voice or silence intensify over time? And, do people change tactics? Do they look at different ways of voicing? Then when are these different ways of voicing needed? And then in our research, we've also kind of thought about this concept of exiting. So instead of voicing or remaining silent about an issue, it could be possible that people will leave an organization. So let's go to our case study and our data really quickly. Basically, we have archival records of the home bank from the duration that it existed. One of the benefits or one of the good aspects of this case study is that we actually have a royal commission which was conducted. And essentially what this royal commission did is they wanted to investigate, well, what happened with this organisation and should something have been done earlier to fix this problem. And they sequestered a lot of information to conduct that royal commission. So we can actually see letters which occurred between all the people involved with the royal commission and how they interacted with each other at the time. We can see the testimony of liquidators and external auditors. So they brought in external experts to look at the home bank and say, well, what actually kind of happened on, and they give evidence of that. And they also have cross-examination of the actors. So the people involved with this were brought in and then, asked a lot of questions by the lawyers, solicitors involved. In addition to that, we've also got, historical newspapers, magazines, and other relevant reports about the home bank. And we've also got the annual reports themselves that the home bank as a company was producing. Our methodology is qualitative and archival. How am I going for time? Just really quickly. Okay. So let's go into the case analysis. So what is the story that we found with whistleblowing at the home bank? And what we found is that there is an evolving group of whistleblowers that essentially two external events happened. In 1916, a group of people wrote to the Minister of Finance about problems within the home bank, and this group of people is what we would call the Western Directors. And that was one kind of like whistleblowing event. Related to that group is, and on a separate kind of occasion, this person, Mr. McAfee, he also wrote to the Minister of Finance to whistleblow about what's happening in the home bank. And we can see from our analysis about how these whistleblowing events occurred. Now, I'll put a little note down here for me to remember this. One of the things is that the home bank was based in Toronto, so its headquarters was in Toronto, but it was spreading throughout all of Canada. And one of the places that it spread to was Winnipeg. And when it went to Winnipeg, this is when the directors, known as the Western Directors, kind of got appointed. And these whistleblowing events really came from people in Winnipeg who were questioning the practices of the bank. But just so that you understand, Canada is quite a large country. Winnipeg to Toronto is about 2,000 kilometres away. So if I had to drive there, it would take me about 22 hours non-stop if I was going to drive there. Or if you're thinking about it in terms of Europe, if it'd be the equivalent of being in, say, Paris and then driving all the way to the Ukraine. So there's a big geographical distance between these two places under which the whistleblowing occurred. So just as a repeat, most of the whistleblowers were in Winnipeg, but they were dealing with people who were in Toronto. Let's go over the main issues which occurred at the home bank. Basically, what happened at the home bank is that they were lending money, and in particular, they were lending quite a lot of money to 3 different accounts. These 3 accounts were identified as problematic by the whistleblowers and notified to the Minister of Finance, the Prudential Trust, the Pallet and Pallet. They owed over $2 million, and Frost Company was about $1.7 million. So Pallet and Pallet was the the person who was building the castle that I mentioned at the start of the presentation, and this is the amount that they owed to the home bank. Now, what was the problem with this? Well, the problem was that there was not enough security, so these loans pretty much did not have much backing. In fact, Sir Henry Pellet was borrowing based on his good word. I mean, it's kind of weird to think of it at the moment, but he basically was borrowing against his name of being a reputable businessman so that he could kind of build a castle. So they were lending money based on that. The bigger problem when it comes to financial fraud is that interest was being capitalized. So these loans here, they were charging interest on them, but they were not receiving any payments. So none of the money that they were getting from all the interest that they were charging against these loans, they were never actually getting any payments to come back from it. Despite never getting any kind of payments, they were still declaring profits, saying we made this much money in interest, etc. And then they were paying dividends. So you can kind of imagine that essentially what they're doing is instead of paying dividends out of money that they've made or profits that they've made, they're essentially paying dividends out of the deposits that they're receiving. And so this is one of the reasons why it's very important for the home bank to keep on growing, keep on getting bigger, so that they could take those deposits from depositors and use them to pay dividends to shareholders, etc. I won't talk too much about the financial situation of the bank now, but if you want to ask questions, we can talk about it later on. Okay, let's go on to what happened with the whistleblower. So the first whistleblowing, it led to a letter being sent to the Minister of Finance in 1916, but prior to that, in 1915, there was a lot of communication between the Western directors, the guys in Winnipeg, and the people in Toronto, where they tried to ask a lot of questions about, hey, well, there seems to be some kind of like practices which are not so good with the bank. Can you please give us some more information about it? But that internal kind of like communication ended up resolving nothing. Like they got to the stage where the Western directors were very unhappy and they felt that they were unable to do their job as director of the bank. So they wrote to the Minister of Finance to express their concern with it. They used a lawyer to communicate with them to say, well, we don't really know what's going on with the bank. It's not being run. We don't have a lot of information about how it's happening. The Minister of Finance received this letter, and his response to this whistleblowing allegation was wholly inadequate. All the Minister of Finance did was that he asked a friend, or not a friend, but a lawyer who he knew to just inquire about, go in there and see what's going on with them. The lawyer that he asked was called Mr. Lash, and he was actually a solicitor for the bank. The Minister of Finance also asked the bank's auditor to investigate, and unsurprisingly, the bank auditor said everything was fine because they had already said that on the annual accounts. And in particular, the minister had this ability to ask for an external auditor to come in and investigate what's going on in the bank, and they never decided to do that, have an external audit at all. And so what did happen, though, was that enough noise was kind of made that the home bank's board and the president started kind of making some what turned out to be false promises to the Western directors. So what they said is that, what we'll do is we'll have an investigation into this. We'll get this person, Mr. McAfee, who will come to soon, to come over and do an investigation of what's going on so that we can kind of resolve this issue. That investigation kind of never occurred, which we'll come to soon. But what happened was this Mr. McAfee, who was working in Winnipeg, he decided to leave his job, and then he was going to become an assistant to the president of the bank with the recommendation of the Western directors. Now, after, the Western directors blew the whistle, they talked about it, they waited to see what would happen. Nothing occurred, and so one by one, they started leaving the bank. They exited, and in particular, of interest was this Mr. Creera down the bottom there. After he exited, he had this ability to sell all his shares in the home bank and exit before it went bankrupt. So that was the first case of whistleblowing. Let's move to the second case of what happened with the whistleblowing. That same person, Mr. McAfee, who was working in Winnipeg with the Western directors, he left left Winnipeg to arrive in Toronto. And when he arrived in Toronto, he was largely kind of like excluded from correspondence and from information within the bank. So even though he had this position, which was assistant to president of the bank, he was not really included in any of the meetings. He was not given access to any of the information about the bank. The Toronto directors and the people running the bank there really tried to exclude him from what was going on within the bank. After he arrived, obviously it was quite maybe stressful for him because he decided to take 3 months leave from the bank. So he said, "Oh, I've got to have leave. I can't keep on doing this work for a while, so I want to have a break." So he took 3 months leave, and then when he returned to come back to work after those 3 months, his office was no longer existent. He didn't have a room to do any work in, and he had kind of like no desk provided for him to work with. He escalated immediately and started talking to these Toronto directors and say, "Well, look, what's going on? We've got like this requirement. We have an oath to uphold, millions of dollars worth of deposits. You have to kind of let me kind of know more." They talked to him a little bit about what was going on, but they again refused to kind of give him information. So he came back with them even stronger and said, "Well, I'm going to send a letter to the minister," and he wrote a letter that he was going to send to the Minister of Finance, and he showed it to the Toronto directors and said, "Well, this is what I'm going to allegate, that that this bank is not being run properly. We have problems with the 3 loans. The auditor is not an accountant." A whole lot of issues kind of raised with the bank. This was met with swift retaliation. He's basically fired from the bank, and they still obviously had, outstanding wages to pay him. So they used that against this employee who was trying to blow the whistle, and they made him come in and coerced him to sign a false declaration that everything was great with the bank and there was no problem whatsoever. After that, Mr. McAfee, he left, but then he decided later on in August 1918 that he was going to blow the whistle to the minister. So he wrote a letter, sent it to the minister, alleging all these kind of issues that are going on with the bank. And the minister received that letter. He simply referred it back to Mr. Lash, who's the accountant, the lawyer for the bank, and to the board. And the Home Bank basically wrote a letter trivialising Mr. McAfee. He's saying he's just a disgruntled employee who's been looked over for promotions, etc. So he had quite a hard time. Now, with the hindsight of the Royal Commission, we can see and we can trace actually that everything that Mr. McAfee said and the Western directors were saying whistleblowing was 100% true, because 5 years after this date, 1923, the bank went bankrupt, it lost money, all these kind of bad things that they were telling about were actually occurring and having serious consequences. So that's basically what we've found. We'll return back to what our ideas or what our contribution to the literature will be from our research. When I started talking at the start of the presentation, I talked about the temporal dynamics of whistleblowing, about how people will move. What we saw in our case study was that whistleblowers really started off internally. They voiced all these kind of concerns, based on altruistic motives. They were trying to do what was best for the bank. When they voiced these concerns, they were kind of met with like a lot of unclear communication, and false promises were kind of given to them, and they were essentially silenced. They were using silence to wait and see what would happen. When kind of nothing occurred, then they would escalate this more. They would use external voice. They would go to this minister and say, "Well, there's a lot of kind of bad things that are happening in this bank. What's going on?" Yet, when nothing happened from doing that, a lot of these, especially the Western directors, they left the bank and they said, you know, there's nothing that can kind of be done. We're going to move out of the bank and we're going to sell all our shares. We're going to be removing ourselves from responsibility that if this bank kind of goes wrong, that we're no longer there. So they used exit as another option when voice had failed. Our research also kind of sees what I call like a crescendo of voice whistleblowing and retaliation. And so as the, you know, whistleblowing occurred over time, the intensity kept on getting increased. So first of all, the retaliation against the whistleblowers was always getting intensified. So first of all, it started off with like promising to do certain things which were not done. However, it escalated to, you know, Mr. McAfee was, you know, lost his desk, lost his office. He was excluded from, you know, being in meetings. All of this retaliation increased to the point where they eventually fired him, and they also forced him to sign this letter to say the bank is all okay. Alongside that kind of retaliation that was happening against the whistleblowers, we can also see that voice was being intensified, that when it started off as like a internal dialogue, it then went external, and people were using threats about going to ministers to try and get some action happening out of it. So we can see this dynamics of whistleblowing intensifying as it goes over time. I guess the other thing that kind of happened a lot was that the whistleblowing was also often, you know, trivialized, that they bring up all this information, which turned out to be true, but at the time they were being trivialized, that they were essentially, you know, thought of as just a disgruntled employee and not someone with any kind of serious ideas. And the final part about the temporal dynamics is we start to see that there's a lot of other kind of parties involved, and we're still working our way through this part of the paper, but we can see that it's not just a whistleblower working by themselves. Often there's a group of people, like 4 people in our situation, who are blowing the whistle at different stages, and some of these people are leaving and coming, but there's many kind of like people involved with the whistleblowing process rather than just a one-off. Also, there's all these people on the side that, you know, Mr. Lash was a lawyer for the bank and also a helper for the minister, was constantly being, you know, used when whistleblowing was occurring. I haven't talked about this so far, but there was actually people who were at the Toronto office who were probably watching what was going on at the bank, and they were asked to sign a letter saying that, you know, all the accounting practices at the bank were great. When they were forced to sign that letter, they said, look, I'm not going to sign that letter, I'm just going to leave, and were essentially fired from the bank. So there's these other parties kind of involved with this whistleblowing process that we're kind of uncovering. And finally, there was a constant kind of change of who was the president of the bank and who were the directors of the bank. So there wasn't necessarily essentially one person that was the wrongdoer. It was like a group of people kind of working together and rotating, which were conducting the fraud at this bank. So the idea of you know, a whistleblowing event occurring between just 2 people was not realistic in our situation. I'll stop there then. I think I've said everything that I wanted to say.
It was so fascinating that we were all listening with bated breath. So absolutely fascinating story, and so relevant to perhaps whistleblowing today. How it just goes to show how history can often give insight to current day dilemmas or ways of doing things, etc. Questions? Nadia has a question.
Yes, actually, I think I have 2. So one is really on whistleblowing, the other one is about the bank. Regarding whistleblowing, you talk about these temporal dynamics, you know, within the process itself. But as Karen has just said, it's interesting to think about it historically. And so I was wondering, how was the kind of whole CSR discourse at the time? Because today, obviously you have these laws protecting whistleblowing, and the banks are supposed to have much more accountability and to show transparency, etc. And I thought that what was interesting is that you said, yeah, at the time their internal motivations were like ethical, while today you would almost have a risk that the motivations are actually unethical because people are almost invited in a sense. So yeah, I was wondering whether you could relate your story to, how the culture was at the time, how CSR concepts were developed or not. And the other question was about the bank. And I was just wondering, I think I didn't really understand what they're doing, these banks. Like, they were doing deposits, and were they also doing investments? And was there anything into their financial problems that kind of resembles modern banks, where they use the deposits to pay for failing investments and things like that?
Okay, I'll try my best. If Miriam and Gary want to come in, they're more than welcome to. So about like CSR and standards at the time, it was very different to now. I would have to say that basically the regulations didn't exist. That a lot of these wrongdoings that occurred at the home bank led to a lot of change in regulations to give more power to oversight, use of external auditors, etc., at banks to keep them on track. So that's kind of one of the changes that's occurred in Canada from the result of this bank's failure. It was a very kind of different situation. They did have a Bank Act, and the people who were whistleblowing were, using their responsibilities as, as a justification for why they were kind of blowing the whistle at the time. But it didn't tend to occur. The second part of the question is, essentially what these guys were doing, we can't understand their motives specifically, but essentially what they were doing is they were using a lot of these finances to finance investments which were not good, and it really did not seem that they were ever going to make any money. In fact, after 1916, they did not make any profit on any of those big accounts at all. So we really don't understand why they were doing it in particular, but it was definitely they were financing unprofitable kind of investments. They were lending to people who, were not going to give them return. Does that answer the question there?
Yes, regarding the whistleblowers, so you were saying that they didn't have this framework, this governance framework. So in a sense, it's purely intrinsic almost?
They did have a framework, but it was not as robust as now, is the way I would describe it. Yeah, so they had a moral obligation to do it, and that's what they were citing. The person, McAfee in particular, was quite aware of his obligations, and the directors were aware that they had to have information about the bank. So that's kind of what was driving their whistleblowing to start off with. However, I think that obligation, or that idea that they're going to help people change to self-interest. Okay, this bank's going to go down. I'm going to be the person who's kind of liable if I'm still working at this bank. So that's why a lot of the Western directors exited and left the bank. I think that their interests changed over time.
Okay,
Thank you. We have lots of questions. Richard has a question.
Was there evidence of corruption? For example, was the Minister of Finance himself involved in other shady dealings, and his mates were in the bank? And so, it doesn't necessarily have to be personal, it can be institutional. But there's, the government needs the money from rich supporters, blah, 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 blah.
Mm.
Whatever. But you didn't mention corruption.
There was corruption. I would say that the minister is more incompetent, is the view that I was given. He didn't really know what the hell he was doing. But interesting that he actually started then working for the bank just before it went bankrupt, and managed to cash an own personal check about 3 or 4 days before it went kind of close its doors. So there is a bit of corruption there, I suppose, that he kind of was aware of what was kind of happening, but it didn't seem like he had direct dealings with the bank. He was quite well known to the president of the bank. I think they went to the same church, the minister and the bank, but under cross-examination, under cross-examination, he was definitely 100% sure that they weren't friends.
They used to say, if the directors have prayers before the board meeting, it means they're crooks.
I like it. Alan, did you have a question?
So it was more of a comment, a couple of them. You said early on that they were paying dividends out of deposits, and I'd be careful with that because people might infer from that they were doing a sort of Potsy scheme, whatever that's called. So I'll be careful with the wording. No, the thing I wanted to mention was that in get my dates right, around about 1996-ish, there was an accountant in the UK that whistle blew, and he got hold over the calls by his employers and sacked, if I remember right. And then he wrote a book, and the book came out in 2 editions, and he was talking about that type of thing. And I used it with my undergraduate students in, what were they, 2nd year? And it was a fascinating insight into the way that businesses manipulate information through the accounts, and just abuse their position as a whole over what they're in control of. And it really resonated with the accounting students. If you look in the literature, I had a quick look while you were talking, and I couldn't find that book. But Gerald Vintner, whose work you probably know about, he's written a lot on that sort of stuff with that era. And there were a lot of people trying to whistleblow with a great deal of success. Anyway, that's all I was going to say.
If you find the book, Alan, pop it into the chat.
Yeah, if I find it, I won't find it today. If I find it, I'll send it to you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then very quickly, Vera has a question.
Yes. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I like your idea of the kind of threshold that where it then leads to this intensification of voice and retaliation. But I was wondering about your use of the metaphors of kind of silence and voice, because the danger that I see is that when you take it too literal, it becomes about, does someone actually say something? Do they utter something, and is that being heard? And what we, I guess, see more often is that information is there, but it kind of evaporates in the organization. Diane Vaughan has written about this on the kind of Challenger accident or disaster, when it's about structural secrecy, that there are information, but they just don't get used. And I think that would be really fascinating also for your case, and would also highlight this idea of the threshold, because maybe you can overcome those organizational dynamics that tend towards kind of secrecy and silence, and manage to overcome them because you have a group of people getting together.
Yeah, that's a really kind of apt point, and one that we're going to look at more going forward. We tend to look mainly at the whistleblowers, but I think the people who knew what was going on but didn't say anything is also equally kind of interest, kind of thinking about these other parties that are subject to it. So that's a really good valid point, and yeah, thanks for bringing that up. We'll have to think about that a bit more.
Thank you, and thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating presentation. A really interesting story. Thank you. Thank you. I think we're going to have to skip our little coffee break and move straight into Vera Link's presentation. And Vera Link is from the WHU Otto Beisheim School of Management in Germany. And she's going to present to us today on nested judgments, how mortality accounts shaped competition among insurance providers.
Yes.
Thank
you. Thank you so much, Karen, for the introduction, and also for the invitation to present my work here. So brief disclaimer, I'm not a historian, so I'm going to paint like a bit broader strokes of history. So I'm going to cover 19th century field of British life insurance. And the puzzle that I'm dealing with is this. So when we look at displays of life insurance providers around the around 1800, we have this, and this is a picture taken from Liz McFall's work on the kind of architecture and insurance. This is from the Royal Exchange Assurance, and Liz emphasizes how life insurance had to be kind of made desirable and most of all reliable. So what we see a lot in displays and advertisements of life insurance throughout the 19th century is this kind of display of grand offices, of really solid architecture that makes the idea of life insurance appear more prudent and more secure. And around the same time, what you have is another form of insurance, namely friendly societies, who mostly cater to working classes, laboring classes, and they had a very different kind of display of what they were doing. So you see here two men shaking hand over a kind of treasury chest. And this is quite in line. So this is not an advertisement, but a banner, and you see similar symbols, those kind of locked hands. This is on a jug, and they all kind of tend to emphasize not so much security but conviviality. These were societies that did usually not have those grand offices in London, but tended to meet in pubs, and this also contributed to their reputation within the field of insurance. They were not recognized as insurance providers at the time around. Often they were not noted in relevant literature at the time. And so there's one in a select committee hearing on friendly societies in 1825. There was one insurance expert who said about them, "I really do not know how they keep their accounts at all. Their manner is not a good one. All the societies are set one foot at an alehouse, and one half of the money is spent at an alehouse." So that was a kind of, very different kinds of providers that were not even recognized as doing something quite similar. And this happens like 80 years later. It changes quite a lot. So still at the Royal Exchange assurance, you still have this display of architecture emphasizing solidity. And then you have the Liverpool Friendly Society, which now also has its building. So that's kind of, we can see, and this is of course only a kind of illustration of the more general point that I'm interested in, namely that friendly societies became more similar to insurance providers, and so similar to a degree that they were even deemed redundant, or that it was imagined that they could just disappear. So this is an actuary in the early 20th century saying the insurance idea finds expression in the friendly societies, so they were recognized as providing insurance. Whether they will someday be lost is a matter which need not greatly concern us. The rapid growth of industrial insurance might give us cause to imagine they will. Of course, they did not immediately disappear, though they did not fare well in the National Insurance Act in Great Britain. But I find this fascinating that within the span of 80 years, a provider had come from not being even understood as a legitimate insurance provider to being accepted as such, and then kind of losing out. So I'm interested in what had happened in this time frame. And so for today's presentation, I will first try to lay out my puzzle, what I'm focusing on, briefly talk about the data, and then go through 4 points of observations that I draw from my material. So there are two key observations for me. First one is that over the course of the 19th century, more segments of the population were deemed insurable, and the second one, that new kinds of insurance providers were deemed legitimate. I think both of them are not really disputed observations, but they usually take place in different parts of the literature. And for me, it is important to see that the two of those developments are connected. And what connected them, and this goes to my thesis, is that something quite inconspicuous began to circulate in the field of insurance and become involved in insurance matters, namely mortality tables. And here we have something, so in the title I speak about accounting devices. This is about mortality tables, and this of course points to what John Horton and Richard McVeigh have written about the kind of exceptionalism of 19th century insurance, where it was mostly about the expertise, not so much of accountants, but of actuaries who could better deal with the specificity of the long-term liabilities related to mortality risk. So this is why the kind of prominence of mortality tables appears here. And so my this point, very general questions. How did mortality tables affect the field of insurance? And with this project, I just want to say that, so I'm in the process of figuring out the framing of the overall piece and my analysis. So this is still work in progress. The background that I'm using is first of all conception of the insurance field as a common meaning system. So this broadly goes back to Scott and Jefferson, so new institutionalists who emphasize this kind of shared social accounts, the same or shared understanding, same conception of norms and how things should be in a way. And to me, this is interesting in looking at other literature on insurance, which emphasizes various types of relations. So looking at relations of exchange, how insurance providers and policyholders interacted, looking also at competition, how insurance providers observed other insurance providers and competed with them, and also looking at relations of governance, how insurance providers and regulators went head to head. And so for me, the point of taking the perspective of an organizational field lies in the connection of all of those points, of those different actors and their involvement with each other. And key for that were insurance professionals, insurance experts that often had a mathematical background, so actuaries and statisticians. And there has, of course, been literature on how this impacted each of those relations, how it impacted kind of competition of insurance providers, how it changed postulations of regulation, how it impacted insurance providers and their outlook onto potential policy holders. But I would argue that they have always focused on this one line. And I would like to look at how those different actors and their various relations were connected as mortality tables started to circulate. And so what I use as an understanding of mortality tables as judgment devices. And this stems from work by Marion Fourcade and Yves Capello. And what I like about their work and what I found really helpful is this distinction between, in Fourcade's term, nominal and ordinal judgments. So under ordinal judgments, she would describe judging in terms of something being better or worse. And the key example here is always rankings, basically. So we have entities. These could be people. This could be products. And they are compared along one dimension and are deemed better or worse. And then we also have judgments that Fourcade calls nominal. So here we have entities that are taken to be part of something similar, but they're simply different. But there's no kind of clear criterion of comparison against which to kind of relate them towards each other. So gender is often an example, simply having the different categories associated with gender. And Capello, she uses this on a level of market segments, actually. So having a niche that you can fulfill with your product and having it distinguished from others. And so part of this this kind of being simply different, what Capello points to is kind of boundary building. So you're closing off. You're saying, okay, these are part of my market, others are not. But what I think is quite important when you look at those nominal judgments or those simply different judgments is they can also go into the other direction. Capello, she only hints at it. But there's a really nice study by Martha Poon on on the FICO credit scores, where she calls on those scores as a kind of generator of possibility. And as soon as you start saying, well, we have gender as a kind of overall group, we have male, female, and then you start thinking about what else may there be. So you can also say that those kind of nominal judgments, they may lead to a kind of boundary expansion. And I think this is what we're seeing in the realm of insurance. And so what I want to look at is how those mortality tables, as they circulated, and those different types of judgment, how they impacted the actors involved in the insurance field and those relations. So my data, in my analysis based on documents, and mostly two types of documents. So one are select committee hearing transcripts, and the other ones are journal articles from the Lancet, the Assurance magazine, and the Statistical Journal of the Royal Society. And it roughly the numbers of articles are as follows. So Lancet was founded earlier in 1823, Assurance magazine in 1851, Statistical Society in 1838. And this part explains the kind of different numbers, but it also shows how debates were shifting. So I chose articles based on a kind of theoretical sampling. When it comes to the argument, now this is the number of quoted articles per kind of chapter of analysis in my working paper and period. It shows that there's a slight shift when it comes to the periods, but I don't want to make a clear-cut linear argument out of this. I mean, obviously, my starting point is this shift between kind of around 1800 and then 1880, but I cannot make a kind of clear linear argument out of that. And so I want to get to the first point. This is about observing populations, and what we see here is that there's an expanding notion of what it meant to be a potential policy holder. This is a table that I found in an article by the actuary of the Alliance Assurance Office, Adler, and he reacted with his study on the classification in the census. And so the government proposed to exclude occupations such as miners, butchers, innkeepers, sailors, mariners, like a range of occupations from ordinary life insurance schemes due to their high mortality. And Adler, he was interested in seeing and determining the exact rate of mortality for those occupations. So you can see that there's a kind of expansion of the occupations that are even being considered, driven by the interest of trying to establish the mortality rate rather than excluding them from the population of insurable people. And maybe even more drastically, you can see this in a study by a guy who initially in his research focuses on the mortality rates of the peerage and gentry, but towards the end of this paper, he has this table. And so what he does, he still has the mortality rate for peerage and baronetage for the gentry, and then he starts adding data on agricultural laborers and other professions. And so here he uses kind of data from friendly societies. This is one of the first times that friendly societies actually pop up in such a table. He uses them as a synonym for the, or not a synonym, but as a kind of stand-in for this segment of the population, expanding the view. And so what he comes out saying is, it may be useful to compare the expectation of life among the higher orders with that which obtains in the other classes of society. So here we have an actuary starting to think of, okay, if we have the one thing, why don't we look into the other direction and see what's happening there, turning towards an assessment of mortality in society more broadly. So again, whereas you've looked at certain segments of the population before, there's now this expanding notion of who's considered a potentially insurable part of the population. You have new categories that, of course, are not looked at wholly disinterested. They are employed by insurance organizations, so they are interested in differing rates of mortality. But there is also this very strong drive towards, first of all, establishing the rates of mortality before using them to establish prices for life insurance. This brings me to the second point. So this was the observation of populations. We have a broader range of occupations or population segments being considered, but mortality tables also started to help observe providers themselves. And you already saw this in this table by Guy, and here again in a table by Nason. So actuaries and statisticians and mathematicians were striving towards laws of mortality. And as I said, this was not only out of kind of scientific curiosity, but also out of reasons of competition, knowing that you had to lower your rates, and so trying to find out what is the kind of lowest reasonable rate for pricing insurance policies. And what was in the early 19th century quickly found out was that general tables were rather inadequate. So tables based on general population data, but data from select experience, so people who were insured, was scarce. So what professionals started to do was to consult all kinds of sources that could be connected to this select experience of people insured. So you can see here in Nason's table, he looks at the German Gotha life insurance office. He also includes a kind of general population, but also looks at friendly societies data, at government annuitants, etc. So drawing together all kinds of insurance providers, not so much, so the friendly societies here, not so much because they were insurance providers, but because they deliver data on insured populations. But this, I would suggest, is one step towards kind of normalizing friendly societies, making them appear as one provider amongst others. And this then leads to, in the mid-19th century, to statements, we must admit that every friendly society is a mutual assurance company. And this is, by the way, quite irrelevant. If you also look at regulation, this is a relevant statement because initially a lot of mutual insurance companies had, before the 1844 Act that started to kind of regulate joint stock companies and among them insurance providers. Before this 1844 Act, mutual insurance officers had started to register under the Friendly Society legislation to get some kind of legal security. But the 1844 law then stipulated that they had to register now under this law rather than the Friendly Society law. So there was this distinction and this upkeep of distinctions, saying that friendly societies are in a way insurance companies, but only for very low rates. So this is a process that is happening over the course of the 19th century. And these two developments, I would say, this increasing recognition of parts of the population that had previously not been considered insurable, as well as the increasing recognition of friendly societies as one kind of insurance provider, they were not unconnected, but they converged in the notion of selection. And this is a kind of third analytical point that I want to make, is how populations were tied to providers. So selection had, of course, long taken place. also before mortality tables came along, before actuaries had gained that prominent position in insurance offices. So what you usually had were health checks, also estimates of social standing, etc. And mortality tables here were quite a surprise, because assumptions of when you look at insurance experts, actuaries, etc., publications of early 19th century, they were convinced that the upper classes had lower rates of mortality. But it turned out to be the other way around. So what they effectively had to do was kind of question the premises of their selection that they had previously carried. So mortality tables reconfigured conventional assumptions about better or worse lives. And here is Tompkins stating something that he had heard from another actuaries, that the rate of mortality stated to prevail in friendly societies was almost the same as saying that the working classes were immortal. I know there are many who still object to it because it is contrary to preconceived notions. So here he picks up on this idea that the data you get from friendly societies, it cannot be true, because as it's established in conventional knowledge, the mortality rates of the working classes are assumed to be higher. And what Tompkins does then after this quote is saying, well, I don't even want to lay claims to the overall mortality rate of the overall population, of the laboring classes in the overall population, but when it comes to selection in friendly societies, this is true. So friendly societies also, to some degree, select. This is one argument for accepting the low rates of mortality among the working classes as they are ensured by friendly societies. And this was really important for actuaries, why they were involved. They were not the only professionals engaged in making decisions about selection. So you also had insurance agents, as well as medical examiners. And for actuaries, this was key, because they based their pricing on predictions. But of course, the realization of their predictions rested on who was actually selected. And then at the same time, we also have debates that I find in the literature about the selection by the policyholder, of course, as understood by professionals. And this is how professionals were trying to make sense of the low rate of mortality that was found in the friendly societies. And so this was one explanation. I imagine that if a man falls into bad habits, one of the first things he does is to drop his club. So the general idea of that part of the working classes insured in friendly societies was that in general they were the more provident and temperate parts of the working classes. They joined those friendly societies, but it was the most reckless and the poor who kind of discontinued the policies. And this is one explanation for the relatively low mortality rates that you see in friendly societies. So also here you can see this kind of increasing normalization of friendly societies. They are looked at with the same tools. You talk about selection and you look at the mortality rates. And nevertheless, when it comes to the practice of being selected by the policyholders, actuaries realize that at the present day, very little disposition is shown by the working classes to make the desired change, i.e. to not just insure their lives with friendly societies, but also with commercial insurance providers. So this was still a kind of segment that was difficult to reach for insurance companies. And this is my last analytical point, changed as a new type of provider appeared, namely industrial assurance officers. And again, Liz McFall has written beautifully about this. So industrial assurance officers, they were commercial insurance providers that sort of imitated friendly society structures, their regime of weekly or monthly payments, and later on, this is what Tim Albon has shown nicely, also copying the friendly society's references to fraternity and conviviality. And so that quite soon was claimed that industrial assurance societies and friendly societies were doing a precisely similar business on nearly similar principles. So you have entities that are now deemed comparable, but you have new criteria for distinguishing them in their similarity. And so industrial assurance societies were often displayed as the professionals and friendly societies as the amateurs. And it needs to be said, but by that time, friendly societies were increasingly regulated. They had started to centralize for more specialized organizational roles and move away from their initial strong focus on conviviality. So industrial assurance societies and friendly societies kind of move towards each other in terms of structure. And there were two criteria that were trying to be used to distinguish them and seeing which one performed better. Were friendly societies better or worse than industrial assurance societies? And these were expenses and solvency. But both of them, for expenses, you can really make a difference between industrial assurance societies and friendly societies. And solvency proved to be really hard to establish as a criterion. There was this idea that friendly societies were more likely to be insolvent, but it was very difficult to argue for that. And so what happened instead is that actuaries and mostly actuaries started to focus on the degree of the capacity to handle their tools, actuarial tools. And so they said that the survival of a friendly society is attributed more to good luck than to scientific calculation, or to ask a village society to supply such an actuarial valuation was equal to asking them to write an essay in Chinese. So they had been accepted into the realm of insurance providers, but were seen as performing worse than others. So friendly societies did not continue to perform well in this kind of niche or segment that they helped to create. And this brings me to my last slide to kind of conclude this journey of the transformation also of friendly societies moving into the field of insurance through the circulation of mortality tables. Mortality tables circulated as judgment devices. For me, this is one of the key observations from my analysis. They constituted the insurability of a wider range of a population. They normalized friendly societies. They reconfigured the relation between insurance providers and policyholders. And they also reconfigured the relation between insurance providers as new comparisons were possible. And finally, I think mortality tables kind of facilitated the rediscovery of insurability of the working classes. So they created a legitimate segment of insuring the working classes, and then delegitimized the existing providers that have long catered to the working classes. So yeah, basically mortality tables help to rediscover the insurability of a long insured segment of a population while tilting a competition in favor of the new provider and eventually crowding out friendly societies. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vera, for an absolutely fascinating presentation all around the changes within the insurance sector and that visibility, if you like, of the working classes and being able to insure them, and the movement of the friendly societies and mortality tables as judgment devices as well. Questions? So Richard had his hand up very promptly.
Nadia,
sorry, Nadia. Nadia, you were first.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure, but thanks. I thought I really liked when you were talking about the insurance as a field of meaning in the beginning. And I don't know that time period, but I was wondering, can you say a bit more about where this idea that life should be insured came from? Were there some kind of political ideals behind it? Was it like social welfare? Was it more like a governmentality thing? Like where, how, can you like trace, the different factors that have influenced the emergence of this idea? Because it's so fascinating. The other question was that I think I didn't really understand. It looks very interesting, the story about the friendly society being displaced by industrial. But yeah, if you could elaborate a bit, what is really going on there in the background? What does it mean for society, maybe for, I don't know, workers' solidarity and things like that? And the also paternalism, I think, because wasn't it that at the time the bosses were supposed to provide this kind of protection? So was it going against that? I'm sorry, I really don't know that time period. So, but yeah, thank you. It was very fascinating.
Yeah, thank you very much. So when it comes to life insurance, I think there the best source is Geoffrey Clark, who's written also a lot on 18th century life insurance, and who nicely shows the kind of varieties in early 18th century of how life insurance was understood, be it as a form of gambling, as a form of investment, or as a form of hedging. And so I think that the understanding of life insurance in British 18th century was really wide and broad. And then it comes down towards the end of the 18th century to actually focus on insurable interest. That is the one side, and the other debate is the reform of British poor laws, where the role of friendly societies is emphasized as a kind of self-help. So yeah, Geoffrey, I would definitely look at Geoffrey Clark. And so for the development of industrial assurance and friendly societies, yeah. So I mean, now I remain within this kind of cognitive realm of how did people think about it, but leave out the kind of structural development. And there, I think there's a really nice piece by Sokolowski on the British health insurance and the national insurance scheme, and which different providers competed with each other. And so yes, there were kind of employers providing insurance. There were friendly societies. There was debate about hospitals being involved also in providing sickness support, basically. But also industry assurance, and friendly societies, industry assurance companies were registered within the National Insurance Act as approved providers. I don't know the exact term. So they really effectively started to compete with each other, and their friendly societies had the disadvantage of being quite traditional, being quite emphasizing fraternity, so they would not take up women, for example, so that industrial assurance companies had a better chance of taking up customers, actually. So this is also one of the explanations why the number of members actually dropped within friendly societies in the early 20th century.
There's like a kind of detachment from the solidarity ideal, or the fraternity, and it commodified. Is that what you would say? Or
I mean, they lost out on those rituals, so it was kind of taken away from this local level, but instead you have this debate on the national level about solidarity. So you can say that it was maybe made more metaphorical, or just reach kind of another group of people, maybe the national population.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you.
Richard.
Yeah, very interesting. It must be more than 30 years that I wrote a paper with Joanne Horton on the history of life assurance accounting regulation in the 19th century, because it wasn't, although the companies had been going, nobody knew how to measure the profitability of life assurance because the periods are so long. And it wasn't till, I think, 1870 that the Life Assurance Act actually recognized actuarial calculations as relevant to deciding how well a company was doing. So the actuaries themselves were having to make themselves into a recognized profession. I can send you the reference to that.
Oh, I've read your paper. I love it. It's
Oh, yeah,
absolutely brilliant. Yes.
with Joe
Yeah.
Hall. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Oh, thank you very much. And I've done a number of ones since about modern life assurance accounting, which is still a complete mess even now. I mean, the IASB haven't really got a clue what they're trying to do. Good. The other thing is there was a lot of literature which we didn't really look at the time about this problem of who was eligible to be insured. And for one reason or another, and you've been exploring this now more detailed, it did look as though the insurance companies were very much on the side of capital and the upper classes, and they didn't really want to be troubled with the lower classes, and made out that they were uninsurable in order to cater to the ones they saw as the right clients to be pursuing. There is a whole literature on that, which I can't give you chapter and verse, but I'm sure you can find it, which is relevant to your thesis, I think.
Yes, definitely. And I think this is really fascinating because you have those two directions. There's this references to kind of traditional conventions of selecting policyholders with a focus on upper classes. But then, of course, you also have the economic interest, and you can see how actuaries are grappling with, for example, data that they get from the British Army stationed in India, and they find that Indian natives who are Hindu have a lower rate of mortality. And then they kind of try to debate, well, they're vegetarians and don't drink alcohols, and they're not British nationals, but maybe they're insurable after all because their mortality rate is low. They have the wrong kind of diet. Of course, they should be eating meat and drinking alcohol. This is what makes for a kind of healthy person. And you can see how those ideas about who was insurable do change from this one side also of economic interest, but also from the other side, of course, of kind of political interest. What about the insurability of people who are sick, who are of females who are unmarried? What about those? What can we do for them? So there are debates coming from various directions using mortality tables as one line or base of argument.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, guys.
Can I just take the opportunity to thank all our presenters today? It's been a wonderful session. Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending. We've had various people coming and going during the workshops as they've had other commitments. But thank you all for attending this morning.